name's Anita Wills, and I'm a writer and an author. I'm a mother, a grandmother, and even a great-grandmother. I'm Afro-Indigenous, a member of the Monacan Indian Nation in Amherst County, Virginia, which is a federally recognized tribe. I am African descent by my ancestors who were brought here as slaves. And of course, there are some white folks in my family as well. And many years ago, I decided that I was going to take it upon myself to identify who my ancestors were, to write it down, because my mother, Vivian Martin Baxter, growing up in Pennsylvania, when I was growing up in Pennsylvania, she was telling me about our ancestors, who they were, especially the natives, because we were in like Chester County, Pennsylvania, and my mother told me this is where our native ancestors were. She said that they were here and they were growing corn long before the farmers that were there when I was growing up in the 1950s who were growing corn. And she said that they had passed the law so that the natives couldn't grow corn and that they had left. And it was just such an amazing story. And she told me about, our African ancestors and some of our European ancestors. But what struck with me is that I could talk about being part white. I could talk about being African. But when I would say, that we had native ancestors, the reaction was like, there are no natives here. That was Pennsylvania. And some people would say, you're just trying to be better. And I thought, why would that bother people for me to say that these are the people who I am part of? I exist because of all of my ancestors, not because of a select few that are comfortable for other people to hear about. So I went out and started documenting, because my mother was telling me, but she didn't have a lot of documents. She was telling me what was passed down to her. And I decided that I was going to document who our ancestors were. And that's when the journey began. And I really got into it in 1978. And I started my search by going to the Mormon temple, because by that time we lived in Oakland, right down the hill from the Mormon temple, and putting together documents. And at that time, I was just looking for names. I wasn't looking for ethnicities or race or anything like that, just names. Because my mother, her family was mixed race, and I knew that if I followed the name, that it would lead back to who we were as a people. I could get some names, I could get something tangible. And that's what I did. And I wrote my first book, Notes and Documents of Free Persons of Color. And I self-published my books and began talking about that, sharing that experience, because when I was out there doing genealogy, there was not a lot of people that looked like me doing genealogy. Most of the people were European, were white, that I saw. And so I began to find my people, find my roots. And in doing that, what I discovered was that my Native American ancestors were right there in the community. and that they were mislabeled, or rather, it's called paper genocide. In other words, the natives in my family were redesignated as mulatto as early as the 1700s. They were redesignating native people as mulatto. And when I was looking in Virginia, I went down to Virginia, and I not only saw the census records, but I went and looked at the laws as they pertain to Africans and Native Americans. And they have these books down there called Hunting Statutes at Large. And those books are the ones that they used to make laws in the colonial days, to make the laws about who was what race, to put African people at the bottom, Native people just a little above the Africans, and Europeans above everybody. Those laws are in that set of books called Hunting Statutes at Large, and they were used to make laws during colonial days, because George Washington had his plantation in Virginia, but the capital was in Philadelphia. Before they moved it to D.C., it was in Philadelphia. So those laws were pertaining to almost all of colonial America. And so in Pennsylvania, it was the same thing. As far back as I went, I saw that my people, my ancestors were mulatto. And I had to figure out where the native was, because were they mulatto, African, and European, or were they, which tribe did they come from, if they were native? And I was able pretty well to do that. And one of the tribes that I want to talk about is the Nanzatico Indian tribe, which the Nanzatico were one of the oldest tribes in Virginia. They called them the Rappahannock. So the Rappahannock Indian tribe was in Caroline and King George County until 1704. And in 1704, an incident happened. A white family that had encroached on the land, the Nanzatico land, were found killed. And the Nanzatico were accused by the colonial government of killing that family. And it just struck me as strange, because why would they kill them when they were complaining to the colonial government that these people were encroaching on their land? If they were going to kill them, it wouldn't make sense for them to continue to go to the colonial government and ask them to, to take these people who were settlers off of their land. And that's what they were doing. They were going to the colonial government, and I guess, they were being ignored because the family was still there, and the family was killed. And so the colonial government, of course, comes and says that the Nanzatico needed to turn over whoever killed that family, because of course we know that nobody in the colonial government would kill anybody. We know that, right? They were slaughtering Indians, natives, right and left. But of course, it would never occur to them that one of them may have killed that family. And 4 of the Nanzatico, 4 men from the Nanzatico tribe, turned themselves in and were instantly tried and hung. But that wasn't enough. The colonial government decided that they would go back and get those people off the land, which is what they did. And they took them to Richmond and made a decision that the adults over 9 years old, do you know any adults that are over 9 years old? You don't have to say, answer me, just ask yourself. Any of the adults over 9 years old were sold into slavery and sent to Antigua. And it just so happened that my direct ancestor from that tribe, Indian Charles, was, 9 years old or older. And he was sent to, the children were sent to serve a 25-year indenture. The children were also forbidden by law to return to their ancestral village. The children were all also redesignated as mulatto or Negro. This was by law. It wasn't just understood. It's in the laws. It's in heading statutes at large. Look up the Nanzatico. It's right there for everybody or anybody who's interested to see. And the family, the adults who were sent to Antigua were forbidden to return to the colony. Think about this, because this was their homeland. And these people, encroachers, decided that they could not return to their homeland. They were forbidden. And so I discovered that. I was looking at the records and documenting them. And actually I had seen it several times, and I just never connected to me until James Nixon, who is now passed, told me. He was Native and he did a lot of research, and he was telling me, I've told you several times that Charles and Ambrose were the son of Indian Charles. They were Nanzatico. And okay, so Charles Lewis and Ambrose Lewis were the sons of Indian Charles Lewis and a mulatto woman named Josephine. And my belief is that they were all indentured to the Lewises, who had gotten the land, because it says that Charles and Ambrose were born in King George County, or they were in King George County when they were indentured out. And they were indentured out, and they worked on, they became seamen on the Rappahannock. And they were on the Page Galley until, and just worked going up and down the Rappahannock, probably delivering from city to city, delivering goods. And when the war broke out, when the Revolutionary War broke out, Charles and Ambrose joined the Revolutionary War as seamen. And then they stayed on the Page Galley after they joined the Revolutionary War, and then they got on another ship, which was the Dragoon. And the brothers completed 3 years of service in the Revolutionary War out of Fredericksburg. And once they did that, they joined the militia and served with the militia and fought at Camden, South Carolina under Colonel Gates. So this was, Charles and Ambrose Lewis, and they were in the Revolutionary War, because from that point, when I learned and could prove they were in the Revolutionary War, it just never occurred to me that there was any, except Crispus Attucks. That was the only one that anyone ever just spoke of. So here I find Charles and Ambrose Lewis were in the Revolutionary War, my ancestors, and very proud of them. And the fact that they were seamen, we know, most people who know about natives know that they lived along rivers and creeks, and that they would have been taught early on how to maneuver, how to have, get on boats and go up and down the rivers and in that area. And so I connected to them, to the Nanzatico, and that was, they were really one of the last ones I connected to. Before them, I was researching, and I say but I was getting a lot of help. I got help from one of my cousins who is now deceased, Perry Pennington, and he and I went on a lot of searches looking for records and documents, and he was really well versed in our family and gave me a lot of information. And I always want to, bring his name up and credit him, because that was my buddy. And we were genealogy detectives finding our family history, and it was, a wonderful time. I truly enjoyed doing the research with Perry. And the other one that we found and connected to was the Penns. And that was such a strange name to me that I thought maybe it was from the Penns, the Penn, William Penn and all them, but they were actually P-I-N-N, Penn. And they were in Lancaster County on a reservation, which was at Indiantown. It was Wicomico, W-I-C-O-M-I-C-O, Wicomico, or Y-E-O-C-O-M-I-C-O. Sometimes it's spelled different ways and pronounced different ways, but it's in Northumberland in Lancaster County, and it was originally the Wicomico Indian Nation, but it was split up. It was they were chased off. The Episcopalian and Anglican churches set up, and Rawley Penn, who is my direct ancestor, he was born about 1740, and his father was Robert Penn I, and Robert Penn I, they called him the Great Man, which means that he was the chief of the Wicomico, and he was taken to the Episcopalian Church in Northumberland County and taken up by the warden. The churches had wardens, and they could go around arresting people. And he was taken up by the warden for not attending church and not paying tithes. And he was fined 40 heads of tobacco. They would put him in, they made barrels, and they called them heads. They were big barrels, and he was fined for not paying tithes and for not attending church. So they were forced to become Christians, to join the Episcopalian Church. And once they did that, then they were considered Christians, but they also had to pay tithes to the church. So when you're thinking about slavery and Africans, and how the Africans just labored for the benefit of the Europeans, they were coming at natives differently because the natives were forced to join these churches. And then, if they did not attend and pay tithes, the warden could issue a judgment against them, could put them in jail, could, you know, uh, could whip them, you know. And so this is this is like the last time I see my ancestor Robert Penn one, and when I found that from the church warden. And then Rawley, like in 1760, I think it was, here's Rawley and his brother, and they're being apprenticed out by their mother, and there's no mention of the father. So Rawley was apprenticed out as a copper, and that's someone who is, you know, when you build barrels, you put the copper strips around the barrels, or you build copper barrels, you know. And so that was around 1760, and then when I heard followed Rawley, and he went up into Brunswick County, Yorktown, and he settled in Amherst County with his, he married Sarah Redcros Evans, and they lived in Amherst County. Sarah's father, who was native, left her land, and that land was the land was in one county, and then they would create another county. So the land wound up being in Amherst County, and she and she and Rawley married, and they had a farm, they had a lot of land. He was buying or getting access to other lands, and by the time of the Revolutionary War, he was, because he was a landowner, he was conscripted to go into the Revolutionary War. And the funny thing about Rawley is that in 1783, in the tax records, he's called a white man. Then in 1785, he's called a mulatto who is living with 8 other mulattoes, and there's 8 other mulattoes on his farm. So when he went to the Revolutionary War, he was considered a landowner. And he joined the unit under Colonel Cabell from Amherst County. And they marched to Yorktown and met up the unit, which was predominantly mulatto, natives, you know, I mean, they just call them all mulattoes. But they all marched together, and they met up with Lafayette, Marcus de Lafayette, on the road to Yorktown. And they marched together to Yorktown. And Rawley Penn was at the siege of Yorktown under George Washington. And with Lafayette, Marcus de Lafayette, and not only was Rawley there, but his brother, Robert, came from Lancaster County and marched there from Lancaster County to Yorktown with his sons, Billy, Jim, and John. And they all fought in the Revolutionary War with Rawley Penn. And Jim, one of the sons, he was killed. And but the other ones, you know, they went on and returned to their lives. So Robert went back to Lancaster County, and Rawley went back to Amherst County. But again, they were keeping ties, even though the natives were not living in the same community. They were keeping ties with each other, and that was just really impressive to me to see that they were able to keep connected, even though they were living in different communities. And because to Native people, family was everything, you know. And so after that took place, Rawley went back to, you know, to being a farmer, and I, you know, so I connected that and I proved that, and then also looking at his wife, who was my ancestor, and that was Sarah Redcros Evans, and we traced her all the way back to Jane Gibson. And Jane Gibson was born like, she was a Native woman, and she is identified as a Native woman, and she's the matriarch of our Evans family, because she married an Evans, but she was a Native, and they were being moved from, like, I mean, she's Native to Virginia, so they were Monacan, they were Sioux, and they were Tulo and Saponi. And what happened was that her children were taken from her. Jane, who was born in 1640, and her children, she allowed her children to go, you know, pick up trades and stuff. And the person that she had sent the children with said they were Negro. And so there became a long history of them having to fight to prove that they were not slaves, because they enslaved the children. And every time she would go, or someone from the family would fight about it, they would move them from county to county to county, which is how Sarah Evans winds up in Amherst County, because that's where her father was. And her father left her and her brother's land. And Sarah's brother was also in the Revolutionary War out of Amherst County. And so there was so much history. So there are so many documents, and you know, putting that together was really interesting, and it was really like time consuming, because there were files, you know. But the next thing I did, once I found out who the Evans were, and is to do, you know, to begin to put that down in writing, you know, to make sure that future generations have it and don't have to do all the research I had to do to put my family history together. But I'm so proud of them. And in Pennsylvania, there are my Martin and Johnson family. These are people who are on my mother's side, my mother's father's side. So my grandmother Martin was actually a Ruth. So grandmother Ruth her mother was a Penn. And so the Penns were directly related to Rawley Penn. And her mother, who was living in Burlington, New Jersey at the time, because their family had been run out of Virginia. Her father was a pastor, a minister. That was my great grandfather, Robert Penn IV. And I'm so proud of them for their accomplishments and fighting for the rights of the enslaved, and which is why they were run out of Virginia in 1853. They were run to Pennsylvania and live right in Columbia, Pennsylvania, which is not that far from Virginia. But they had to keep running because the militia, the white militia, was the law of the land. So the white militia would run down run down not only slaves but free blacks. And if they caught you and took you far enough south, nobody would ever find you. So their struggle, was as black people, as free blacks. And they became free blacks because of the law and because of where they lived. Because in Fredericksburg, I found out there was a beautiful, vibrant community of natives, people who were redesignated as mulatto and free blacks, and they intermixed and they intermarried, and they had a community that was self-sufficient. Ambrose Lewis, who was in the Revolutionary War, he had been shot and stabbed and was taken prisoner by Lord Dunsmore. And that was who George Washington defeated at the siege of Yorktown. But after the war, Ambrose had a wagon, and he would go down to the ships, and he would get goods from the ships. He would get paid to deliver them, or he would buy them and resell them. And that was what was going on in the community. And they were living in the midst of slavery and trying to help slaves. So most of the time when I would find records of them getting in trouble with the law, it was because they were helping the slaves, and they were being accused of helping the slaves to read or write or to escape. And the entire free black community was always being overly policed, just like we are now. And so I found that out, and documented that, and that's Virginia. And Pennsylvania, you would have thought that Virginia would have been worse than Pennsylvania, but Pennsylvania, where my mother was born, and her mother was born, and her father, my grandfather, and on and on and on, and where those natives had been for like 10,000 or more years, had been coming and going freely. Pennsylvania actually has a worse history with Native Americans than Virginia. They had a history of massacring the natives on their own land to take the natives' land, and then accusing the natives, when they fought back, of being savages. And within that family in Pennsylvania, by the time that I came along, there was just areas that we could not go to as black people and as native people, because the land is now owned by Europeans, and the sad part about what was going on with the natives in Pennsylvania is that the settlers would come in and they would take the land, and then they set up workhouses to arrest the natives, to arrest them, because they were loitering, or they had nowhere to live, or they were not working. And there's just list and list and list of these people who were taken off their land, and the children were taken and put in orphanages, and the adults were put in workhouses in Pennsylvania, and also in Pennsylvania was several massacres But the last one was at, 1765 or so, around there, when in Lancaster County, where the Fulton Opera House was. It used to be a jail, a county jail. And so the line of my family that lived up in the Welsh Mountains was there, where there's natives long before Europeans came. And when the Europeans came, they began questioning why the natives were in the mountains, why the natives were on the land, and are they natives? Oh no, they're not natives. They're mulatto. They're mixed race. They're black people. They're Negroes. They're colored or whatever. Anything to be able to justify taking them off the land, using race as a weapon. That's what happened in my family. And there were some natives that were being chased, and they had went up into the mountains, and then some of the there was women and children and elderly that came down and were asking to be protected from the people who were chasing them, because the other natives were out fighting and they were left alone. They were afraid. So the sheriff said that they could stay in the jail, and they would be safe. And they all went into that jail. And then this group of militia, I'm gonna call them a militia, the Paxton boys, broke into the jail. I think they broke in. I hope the sheriff didn't open the door for them, and murdered the children and the women and the elderly who were in that jail cell. And that was like the last Indians in Pennsylvania. And that's, really sad, because they were Conestoga Indians, natives, and my ancestors in Pennsylvania were Conestoga, Susquehanna, Mohawk, and it was just like reading that. It just was like the most sad thing I could think of. What kind of human being murders little children? And not only murdered them, but desecrated their corpse, buried them under the jail. And then they built the Fulton Opera House. And then they don't want us to talk about our history, because they have no intention of apologizing for their atrocities against us, but they don't want us to talk about it. And I want to talk about Queen Alquippa. She's the head of the Iroquois, and she met with Washington. She was negotiating with Washington. The natives continued to try to negotiate with William Penn in Washington in Pennsylvania, believing that they would keep their word, because they had never met someone who would give their word and not keep it. But Queen Alquippa, she negotiated. She went into the Ohio Valley because there were some natives who had been chased off their land in Maryland and Delaware and Pennsylvania. And she brought them back and said that she would negotiate with William Penn to make sure that they were able to stay on their land. And she did that. And William Penn ceded like 500 acres in Chester County to the Native Americans, to those people who they call the Okie-Hoking. So I wrote, my last book is Minkwa Unami Okie-Hoking and the Downriver Nations. And that's who he was talking about when he was talking to Queen Alquippa. And Queen Alquippa is an interesting person. She's the first Native woman who I've read about who was the head, who was a chief. And she even has a county in Pennsylvania named after her, Queen Alquippa, Alquippa County. And and William Penn even signed a warrant, and it's 500 acres. But as soon as he went back to England, the settlers came, and again they attacked the natives who were on the land and ran them off. Not ran them off in the sense that they left, ran them off in the sense that they could not be native and stay there. And they became mulatto colored Negro. And on my birth certificate, before they changed it, it said colored. And my mother's birth certificate, mulatto. And they would call, sometimes within one generation, my ancestors, my people, especially my grandfather, I'll point that out, Grandfather Martin, he was listed as mulatto and colored, and then black. Went all the way to mulatto, colored, Negro, and then black. Just in his lifetime. It's according to how they felt. And they used race as a weapon against us. And they used their religion to justify the murder and the slaughtering of innocent people who were just living on their land and not bothering anyone. These people who welcomed strangers who came, who helped them survive winters, who made meals for them, they slaughtered them. And these are my ancestors, and I'm so proud of my ancestors, and to be able to speak of them and to say, ahoa, I am proud of my Native American ancestors. I'm proud of my Native American ancestry and my African American ancestry. In the Civil War, I'm going to say this before I close, my great-great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfathers out of Pennsylvania were part of what they call the Christiana resistance. And Christiana is in Lancaster County. And this was the same Lancaster County where they had killed those natives. Okay, so here comes this Gorsuch. He came to the house of William Parker, and this was on 9/11/1851. And William Parker was a free black person. And not only was he that, he was also a part of a Negro Mutual Association that was actually started because of a speech that Frederick Douglass gave when he came to Lancaster County. He had gone there and he spoke to them, and they were just like so, proud, to hear Frederick Douglass speak, and they formed a Mutual Association of Negroes, and they would when the whites came at night, like the white militia, kidnapping black people, whether they were slave or free, they would be there to meet them, because they were sworn to give their lives to make sure that none of their brothers were taken into slavery. So a lot of those militias were giving their lives too, and they were getting the whippings of their lives. But this morning, Gorsuch came with his son Dickinson Gorsuch, and they would bang him on William Parker's door, and he said, "Ain't no slaves here." And they were like, "Well, let us come in and look. let us come in. Oh no, you're not coming in my house. No. And and I want you to get away from my door because the guy was really aggressive. I want my slaves. I want my slaves. Well, they had passed this law, the Fugitive Slave Act, allowing the marshals to come and into free territory like Pennsylvania to look for their slaves. They passed the Fugitive Slave Act, and so that morning, when he would not leave William Parker's door, William Parker shot him, and he died. And as soon as that happened, when the white militia turned around, because he was, of course, with a lot of other white people who were part of the, who had been given powers by the federal marshal. When they turned around, they were surrounded by a sea of black faces, and those black people had assembled because William Parker's wife, who was in the attic with the slaves and protecting them, had blew a French horn out the window, and they heard it, and all the Negroes, freed blacks, came a running, and they whipped some behind, and they didn't have any guns. The white militia had guns. They didn't have any guns. They had farm equipment. They had, they had hoes. They had rakes. They had, whatever you use on a farm. That's what they were using against guns. I don't even think they got a chance to pull out their guns, but they ran them all the way. And so after that, there was, they were arresting every Negro person for treason, because you're supposed to help, give these people, their property, which is a human being, a slave. Okay? Anyway, so the next day, here comes Gorsuch. Here comes the federal marshals to arrest them. They called in the Marines, and they just picked up any old black person. They didn't pick up William Parker because he was on the Underground Railroad with the blacks that were in the attic. They all went to, they were in Canada by the time that these folks, was looking for them, because as soon as this happened, William Parker was on the Underground Railroad, and they were trying to accuse Frederick Douglass of helping William Parker get to Canada, which he probably did. Thank you, Frederick. But my great-great-grandfather, he was arrested. That was Henry Green. He was arrested, and his neighbors were arrested, and they were put on trial. And they had an attorney who was a friend of Lincoln, Stevenson. His last name was Stevenson. I'm forgetting his first name. But when they went on trial in Philadelphia 2 years later, he told them, his name was Thaddeus Stevenson, and he told all of them to make sure they dressed alike, they put their hair alike, and they sat by each other. That's what they did, and they were found not guilty because none of the white people could identify them. And so it went on from there, and most of the men that participated in the Christiana resistance, including William Parker, served in the Civil War. My great-great-grandfathers, two of them, and their brothers served out of Lancaster County. And William Parker, I believe that he served with the 54th Massachusetts. He went to Canada, but he came back. And he was in a Civil War. And I'm so proud of them. And these are just some of the stories that I was able to uncover And we need to talk more about these stories with our children. They don't want us to, they call it, they call it critical race theory, but it's history. I was taught history by my mother, and my father taught me to do critical thinking, to think about and research, and when you're saying things, to look it up, see what you're saying, and always be able to prove your point. Well, we prove our point to the best that we can, because we've been there's so many lies that we have to overcome to get to our truth. And I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about the people in Palestine and how similar our histories are. The history of an aggression, because they want our land. They want what God gave us, what Creator gave us. And they are upset with us as if we've done something to them other than just be born. We were just born. And that's where we were born. This is where I was born. And my heart is with the Palestinian people. And they have a history, we have a history, and we should not be ashamed of our history. And please continue to check in with me. I'm going to continue to share, and I'm going to continue to, be that historian and be that activist, and to live my life to the fullest. And I hope you will too. And we're going to see each other soon.